How do they handle conflicts? What's the balance of short-term, long-term thinking? How do they process feedback? How they create psychological safety? I could sense some of that wasn't there. I kind of like just brushed it away that, okay, we'll in some ways deal with that later. But then it was like in the long term hurt the overall growth.
Hi, I am Sophie Vaux, and this is the Rise and Play podcast. In the show, I sit down with influential thought leaders of the gaming industry to deconstruct how they create the best team and company cultures in order to create the best games. Every episode brings actionable insight to improve your leadership, self-awareness, and emotional management skills. Because becoming a better leader starts with becoming a better human. So, are you ready to unlock your full potential in life and business? Let's begin. Don't just see the future, know the future with today's sponsor, Solsten. They make it easy to identify how your audiences and players actually play and what keeps them coming back for more. In a previous life, I used Solsten Product Navigator for a game in soft launch and discovered that my audience was more complex than I thought. Instead of one homogeneous group, I was able to identify two unique personas, take a series of calculated risks in our game design, and strike a balance between the two groups. Our approach shifted from making a game for everyone to creating a personal experience for our most valuable players. And we were able to put our resources and time to good use and launch our game with a high level of confidence in its success. Visit go.solsten.io that you can find in the show notes for a demo. Mention Rise and Play and receive a free feature, theme, and art style study included with your Navigator purchase, a $20,000 value. Learn why EA, Supercell, Wooga, and more use Solsten to create the best human-centric gaming experiences possible. Alright, welcome to a new episode of Rise and Play today, and I'm super excited for the guest we're having because not only he's very experienced designer and product manager in games, but he's my very good and dear friend from Finland. It's Collin Foss. So before we start with Collin, let me tell you more about him. So Collin has been working in product and game design roles for over 12 years. And with his longest stint was at Rovio, where he was a game lead and head of the Puzzle Studios game design craft. Not so late after, he joined as the CPO of a new startup company, Skunkworks, and that's what we will talk about today. So for the context and why I cared of making it a whole episode and having Collin for the conversation today is that Skunkworks is no more, doesn't exist anymore. It's closed sometime last year. While we talk a lot about how companies start, we rarely talk about how they end and how they close. And it's also part of the journey of a life of startup. And how does it happen? How do you do it? And how do you bounce from it? How do you recover? And how do you continue? And this is also an important conversation for people who might go through this or are close to go through this. And we don't have to be ashamed. And there's a process as well to go through this to continue, peacefully in the game industry. So without me talking further, Collin, welcome to the podcast. How do you feel today?
Hey, Sophie. Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much for having me. And it's really great to kind of be able to open up about this topic. And I think what you mentioned about it being really critical, I think taking a look back and doing retrospectives, even in the most difficult failures, I think it's really important.
And I'm very grateful that you come to talk about it because I like to think sometimes, when you've been part of the foundation of a company, closing it, it's a grieving process. It's painful, it's sad, it's shameful, like all the negative feelings that are associated with it. And sometimes you want to move on and not look back and never think about it again or talk about it again. So I'm very grateful for, the time and taking the time to look back and exactly share the experience with others. And for the context and our listeners here, let's start with a start on how Skunkworks started and how you started there.
Yeah, sure. I left from Rovio in 2019. I had been there for 5 years and I had kind of was looking for something a bit different to grow. And I think also if you've been working in a company for so long, there is a sort of status quo, maybe a narrative in a way that carries with you, and whether that it's a positive or negative thing, it was more just for me about change. And I wanted to see what else was out there. So I was doing some game design consultancy, kind of figuring out what I wanted to do after Rovio. And I met up with James Kramer, who was the who's the CEO of Skunkworks at the time. They were just getting started, and we talked a little bit about our shared interests in bringing new experiences to mobile gaming audience. They showed me the game Emma's Kitchen. I got excited. It was kind of like a new take on merge games. And yeah, we went from there and we started talking. I did some game design consultancy with them, helping building that game, but that didn't go forward. And then of course we discussed further, and then I eventually joined as CPO.
Also, you joined as a co-founder, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. So, I mean, the company was already founded before, but we discussed with James that it only made sense because the experience that I brought and the perspective that I was much needed within the team. There was actually no one in the team that had worked on a live game in a product or design fashion in a free to play game. Most of the team was either students, and then of course James, who had been working on a number of different projects, different games, but never as from a design or a lead perspective. So yeah, that was kind of the rationale there.
Because it's always a bet you're taking, when you join an early startup, and we can talk maybe later about where you're at, but what made you believe in this company when you joined in 2019, whether it was with your role or, with the CEO, the co-founders, the vision? And this is also the second part of a question I want to ask, more tricky. Based on the motivation you've had when you join, with now what you know, what else should have been part of the motivation? So kind of comparing a bit, your motivation, Collin, 2019, and maybe the motivations of Collin in 2023, yeah, 22, 23, after this experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think the opportunity there was what really got me excited was just the opportunity to have just a big impact on the team and mentor and help the guys build a product. And I think in a bigger company you start to feel like a cog in the wheel. And I think that was what drew me specifically to startup. And I think it was just sort of happenstance. I think at that time that I happened to be in that mental state where I was ready to take the dive into startup. I didn't actually like do any real due diligence, or unfortunately, I think now, like in retrospect, obviously there's a lot more of this thoughtful approach that I take now. But for me, it was just the excitement of, hey, we have this opportunity to make this game. I was just first helping out a little bit in the beginning just to see how the chemistry worked, and it worked well. And then, yeah, we just kind of, it went one thing from another. We saw that Merge Mansion was doing quite well, and so we went full force into that game and built it in 8 weeks. And that kind of, that fast pace, always seeing something new, and then finally seeing the results was really exciting. So it just kind of, I think just a domino effect of situations kind of led me to that. So in retrospect, obviously, I think there would have been more thought process here, but then yeah, I think it kind of just turned out that way.
When you start a job, there's always a honeymoon phase. And what you describe, like that kind of a phase where everything is exciting you do. And maybe this has been maybe the start of a sense of an end. Maybe it was not that conscious at the time. But
Mm.
what were the challenges you could see that crystallized even more further the development of the studio or of the game? What were the challenges you started to see after you joined?
So I maybe I'll just before we get into like sort of these challenges, I think it's a really important thing for me to say that I just want to recognize that like startup life is often very messy, and decisions are sort of magnified, conflicts are really amplified, and these like outcomes are sort of, you make a decision and it turns out bad, it actually has a quite massive impact on the success of the company, whether comparing it to like a larger, more established companies. And I kind of just want to share those learnings, and I want to first express gratitude. I think it's first and foremost because it was a great opportunity to work at Skunkworks and to join those guys. And so when I get into some of these challenging things, I just want to, for me, it's from a place of like, I want to learn and grow and try to do better next time. I just thought I would say that first, because some of these are a little bit like, they're very on the nose, and they will sort of, in necessary terms, you kind of have to like, there are some finger pointing. It's more of a reflection of the situation. I think everyone can grow and be perfect in a right environment. And I would say maybe recognizing that maybe some of these, situations were not the right for certain people, and maybe that's why they acted in a certain way. So I just wanted to small disclaimer before I dive in, but to answer your question, I think the first thing that I noticed was this lack of leadership experience. So I think a lot of the things which you mentioned, a lot of the focus on culture. That I mean, granted, it is a startup, and we're supposed to move fast, and we're supposed to do things quickly. So it's meant to be that, hey, we're starting a business, but I think there is a way that we can do it. And I think having in the back of your mind certain things, how code of conduct, the way that you have conflicts with others, the way that you talk and make decisions. I think a lot of these things you'll get from more mature developers, I guess you could say, people that have been around the block. And I think that's something maybe in the future that I look for now. And that's, something that when I go now for a new startup or a new endeavor is something that I look for is some of these things around the leadership experience. How do they handle conflicts? What's the balance of short-term, long-term thinking? Yeah. And how do they process feedback? How do they create psychological safety? These things. I think these were like the very beginning. I could sense some of that wasn't there. And I kind of like just rushed it away that, okay, we'll in some ways deal with that later. But then it was like in the long term hurt the overall growth.
It's interesting because it's kind of a mistake that is repeated over and over again, where I understand like the survival is kind of a motto of a company. Like,
Mm-hmm.
let's ensure we have something to present, to deliver cash, revenues, all those things are like nice to have. Culture, code of conduct, ways of working, we'll get back to it later. The thing is that is not always understood is as a group that you get together, you don't know each other. Most of the time, that's kind of a story. You don't have a very clear vision because you're in the forming. So it's like, okay, let's make a hit. Let's make a first merge game that has 30 million, whatever. That's your vision, right? So starting to make a first game that is successful. So it's not very solid, deep, or full of purpose. That and also multicultural context, people with different background, different experience working together and collaborating and solving problems quickly. And all of those things are done very inefficiently when you don't have defined a common purpose, like direction, like why are you even here as a group, ways of working that you have agreed on. And especially like where they are reflected, it's conflict management because you will disagree a lot of times.
Yep.
And area of responsibility, very important as well, because everybody is wearing multiple hats and sometimes it's overlapping. And then you end up with people making a decision on things that they shouldn't be making because they don't have the experience or they don't have the information or context. And this is where all those things get messy and then lead to a not effective outcome. So I would put this as well as a reminder for young startups. You think you're saving time by not investing in it, but at the end of the day, everything that you do is less effective, efficient because of not doing it. And it has a cost over time that we will talk about, of course, which is mostly, well, not leading to a good product outcome, but then team being dissolved, not being able to work together. And then when you don't have a team, then you don't have a product.
Yeah, and it just to highlight something as well. I think I also recognize my own. So this is not some me in the ivory tower. Like I'm also reflecting on my own ability to be a leader in these situations. I mean, I was as much a part of, and if not, part of the reason why these things took place. So I'm fully like accepting and understanding, accountable for my contribution there.
And just for a clarification, did you have anyone in the company at the time who was responsible to define that culture or, like these ways of working, or nobody was owning it and it was whoever was picking it up?
Yeah, so it was a combination of Oli Raudas, who was the COO at the time, had somewhat of that hat. I mean, he was working as operations, so he was looking at all the HR, basically the more administrative stuff as well. But I was the game lead, so team lead in the project. So I was also doing some of that. I did do some of the racy, so like doing the responsibilities, accountability, and consulting, informing kind of framework as well. That was some stuff that we did, but it was let's just say there were a lot of things going on at the same time, that this was less of a focus. And when we did push to do some of these things, there was maybe not as much excitement or interest in doing these. It was more like, okay, let's just do it so we get it out of the way, rather than, taking full. It's a bit tricky one, because I also think that in retrospect, maybe some of the approaches of how to build those, I think I've learned a lot since then. And I think, creating that framework of, like, for example, ways of working, I have a little bit more tools in my toolbox that
Mhm.
I would go to. So there's maybe a combination there of basically not knowing too much about exactly how to do it, better ways, and then the team not maybe 100% buying in.
And as we get here in like highlighting this one of a core, I would say, challenge and missing parts at starting a company, let's also get here in more actionable solutions as what you can do when you find yourself in this situation. So we touch on some points here, but I wanted to list some of those. Again, for young founders, no one else will own the culture of your company except you as the CEO or the founders, like the core founding team. So if it's no one is owning it and it's who's not in your team, I would say, well, no one is taking care of it, and that's not a good place to be, because people want to have clarity where they are working, what they are doing, why they're doing it. So someone should be a clear owner, and that should be someone on the top management team. So COO is fine. I would say ultimately it's the CEO who should make it a priority. And then more concrete things as well is, we've mentioned ways of working. It comes from clarity. Of course, when you have clarity on your mission, what you're building and why, then you can have more clarity on the culture, so the values that will help you get there, right? Because it's not just values for values, and being a company as a group to exist and hang out there, and like just holding hands, but making specific games in the direction in the market with specific purpose. The most concrete thing I found in ways of working is a handbook, employee handbook. You
Mm,
write down everything, like you said, RACI. Who does what is the process to define, distribute the roles, responsibility, who's accountable for what, who's consulted and informed, how decision making is done, how do you solve conflicts, how communication is done, like more concretely, like are you going more for direct or indirect, how do you give feedback. So all those things could be written down. It takes some time. Fortunately, there are many companies that have done it, and you can also borrow it from other companies who are sharing their own handbook, and it's a starting point at least. So you have some principle you can start that are agreed ways of working. And at last, something I found very helpful in my own also experience at Savage Games, where I can recognize that it's a typical problem of startup, where it's not even like lack of experience in leading roles as a leadership team, but as a leadership team working together.
mm,
And the most concrete way is first acknowledging that you have always things to learn, and it's very important to be a good leader in the sense like self-aware. Why are you doing things when emotion gets in the way of your decision? And if they get in the way, like it is the case for many startups, what is your process? What are your tools to go back to more objectivity and make the right decision? And that goes back to roles, distribution, and your own management, like of emotions. Having a coach, I know it's an investment, but I will repeat it. It's the best investment you can make for all the money you'll save in the future and the troubles. So it's worth the investment. But that's the concrete solution I can think of
mm.
as a start. Do you have other things in mind from your own experience?
No, I mean, I think this is, I look at, fast forward now to Papukaya just a little bit, and those are like a lot of those things that you mentioned are things that we're doing, and credit to Drusilla for CEO of Papukaya for making it a priority. Having a coach, having checkpoints on all these ways of working. We have hats discussions, who's doing what, and yeah, really really good stuff. So a lot of the things you mentioned were spot on.
Yeah, and I'm so happy that you joined Drusilla. She was also on the podcast during the early days, so she's been pretty consistent to what she has announced, and I'm
Yep.
happy to hear as well that you joined for those reasons. So let's continue with the story of also here Skunkworks, where all right, you started, and to be honest, I was like very supportive and following much friends that I remember we were like well, at least for us, it felt like head-to-head competition. Our team was very excited, about your game, and we were taking a lot of inspiration, as we say, inspiration, borrowing ideas,
Sure.
and you were, I remember, to us, a studio, a very credible competitor, and Merge Friends seems to be really growing well. Like there was a nice production of content, the game was cute, good gameplay. And I was really surprised by the news later when, the studio was closing 3 years after. So I'd like to hear more of the story when it started to be the end, and more internally, what were the real challenges that started to make question the future of the company. I don't know if it was on product or company side and whatever you can reveal, but where you realize, okay, this will be the end, like soon. What was the situation and what were the main reasons?
Merge Friends went global in March of 2021. All signals were really healthy. All the metrics really great. I mean, day one was still consistently 55 to 60%, and we had still really good, day 30 retention, something over 20%, and the return on ad spend was very healthy. So over 100%. It was like 200, 300% during the early days, and that's the golden cohort. That's what we expected. A whole bunch of games came out during the summer of the 2021. And then in September, we started to get signals that, hey, we did a large scale UA push and they were not positive. So we only got something like 60% back of some hundreds of thousands of dollars that we put into, because you need to test in some ways to scale, to see how the game
Yes.
scales, right? And that's a financial investment. You check it week on week. And we saw that, hey, some of the early cohorts weren't performing well. And that was, for me, a clear signal that, there was a ceiling for the growth in the game. And that was telling there was smoke. There was like clear smoke. There was a fire there that like, hey, this is where we're capping. We can't continue to spend more to grow the game. And so then at that point, that would have made sense to sort of evaluate the financial situation of the company. Hey, what does it look like if we continue this burn rate without growing, considering that we have this game that, has this growth path, etc. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case. And in kind of fast forwarding in March of 2022, so after the winter, it started to be clear that we weren't going to be able to scale the game. We had already doubled down. We had another team as well. We had a game called Project Orca. And then we also had even another merge game, which I was working on. But yeah, anyways, we had 30 plus people, and it was clear that things had changed and the game was no longer sustainable. And we had a hard time as well trying to find additional funding. So it started to look quite dire.
What was then the financial situation at the time for you? And what was that time when in your position you knew we have X months left? What do you do at this point? You knew it was the end, or did you try anything? What started from there?
So I think maybe the first real clear alarm was in late March 2022, because I think up until this point, there was a perception that we could always raise another round based on the growth prospects. I think we had done a really good job of hiring. I think that was one thing. This like newcomers after the founders, a lot of really talented developers came in, and I think we had a solid foundation for building a company. But then if the core is maybe a bit rotten, that doesn't help. But then the war in Ukraine happened. Inflation started to increase. There were higher interest rates overall. The financial markets changed drastically. You can see that now. There's still a ton of layoffs that are happening. But we were sort of still in this still fight or flight, this kind of fight mode where we're kind of still fighting for our position, not really thinking about what is good for the long term. And so we were kind of jumping from one thing to another, and it created that kind of, in some ways, like unguided growth. And it definitely needs to be rung in, but that's something that we can dive into as well.
And as you found yourself struggling to raise the next round, what happened in the order of things? Who knew? How much were you involved in this conversation? And, I'm curious also about the timeline where, okay, this is it. We are out of money. Like, was the closing happen immediately, or you had like a slow down, like trying to save and being small and lean again? How did those things turn out?
As I said, in basically in March of 2022, it was clear. So it was clear that the game wasn't going to scale, and we had 30 people, and we probably should have acted quicker. I think at that stage when we already saw that March, but the fact is that already in September, there were signs. We hired quite a lot in
Mm.
January of 2022. So, but yeah, anyways, one thing that I'll note here is that we did hire, and I think this is really important for the phase in which you're moving into soft launch. This is also something we discussed a little bit with Trail Mix.
Mhm.
They talked a little bit about their need for a CFO earlier. They would have liked somebody to come in and sort of be more of like a business manager in a way to ensure that the game is performing well, that the business case of the game is solid. Because it's a lot for one game lead, for example, to handle both the product strategy and then also look at, okay, how does this work as a business, and then managing the entire team, etc. So
Mhm.
having somebody else as a counterpart CFO makes sense, but there's actually very rare. It's a very rare hire to find CFO that has the ability to look at the business case from a UA perspective, just because most CFOs, traditional CFOs, are more on the counting side. So finding
Yes.
somebody that has more of a business side is quite tricky. So, anyways, we hired somebody. Unfortunately, that one, it didn't work out, and I think this is some area where I would encourage those that are in that stage where they're growing to get somebody to help out in understanding the business side, because it is actually like a quite challenging endeavor to look at, okay, each week on week cohort to see how it's growing and see how the game performs over a long period of time, coordinating with UA and the game team to ensure that's a product role. But I think there's also like a more financial side there about projections and forecasting that I think is really critical to understand, like how the game affects the
Mhm.
runway of the company. That is actually like a full-time job, and just something as a word of wise to new startups that are kind of in that phase. It's really important to hire for that.
Yeah, that's a key learning. And let's get to the most difficult part of the conversation, which was the actual closing of the company. So I would like to understand the sequence of events when it was decided that it will go, bankrupt, and yeah, how was it communicated to the team, the staff? What was the timeline? What happened? How did you support people out? Who was the last standing?
Yeah, there wasn't very much. The financial transparency here was quite limited. It wasn't until May of 2022. So March, I think within the team, within the leadership team, we kind of had an idea that, okay, we really, really need to start trying to get more money, because it's looking that the runway is, it wasn't actually still clear at that point, which is surprising, I
Mm.
think. But then, yeah, in May of 2022, we actually ended up firing the CFO. And I think, yeah, maybe a reflection there would have been good to have this extreme ownership of this situation, and instead of necessarily blaming the CFO for this, the situation had been there for quite some time. There have been plenty of signals before that something should have taken place, some action could have taken place. So, but there was a bit of a scapegoat situation there that it rubbed me the wrong way, at least personally, and I felt like I could have done something more to stand up as a leader. And I think that's a reflection for myself, that I felt bad after that hey, I'm co-founder within this team, and not being able to say anything, or maybe it was a fear, lack of courage to say something about that. Yeah, anyways, I'm digressing slightly, but yeah, all conversations essentially led to the point where in June we announced the ute, and naturally the team was very shocked. Everyone was had no nobody had any idea. There was a company party, actually a summer party right before that, a week before, without any hint of this kind of action coming. There were signals within the Merge Friends team that, like, very clear that, hey, we need to do something now. This game does not perform. So there was a lot of monetization fixes that in the end actually did do quite well, but it was already too late. So there was the Ute. And then after summer holidays, we did as a team our best to sort of make sure that everyone had a job lined up. And we did a pretty good job, I would say. We all like went out to our own networks and made sure that everybody had a job lined up afterwards. So I think that was good. I think already the failings before, which was that the communication regarding the financial situation of the company, it just created this situation like, whoa, like, how could this have happened? People were so shocked and mad, and rightfully so. I think that's exactly how, I would have felt if I wasn't in there. So, and this was also the time when Seriously announced their layoffs, and sort of there was this feeling, I think, of maybe if it was by ourselves, like if we were just the company just failed and there was nothing, it was by yourself, it could have been blamed basically just solely on us. And I think obviously you create yourself situations in order to succeed and control your own destiny, but there were other companies that were also closing down, so it was the financial situation was affecting many. And so yeah, it's hard to say whether or not, I don't live in the alternative reality situation, but you kind of play around with the idea that, hey, if this thing didn't happen, what could have been? But yeah, it's more just a food for thought in a way, just to think about it. And but I certainly don't live in that world, and I really appreciate the situation and how challenging it was at the very end to sort of move on to the next thing, and for many people who are just really shocked that it even came about.
Yeah. And as we're closing the conversation also today on that, I would like to summarize some key takeaways, like having a clear owner of your culture, your ways of working, what you're doing, where you're going. And we discussed about those tools. But I think here it's in the foundation, like if you don't care about like how the company works, it doesn't matter if you are all focused on the product, because later when you have really difficult situation and decision to make, nobody is showing up, right? So clear area of responsibility. And we discussed also about having someone clearly owning the finances of a company. It's one that is overlooked so much. I still see it in young companies and focusing just on the product. But it's so vital, especially in this context where it's not guaranteed that you will get money next. But so when
Mm.
you raise, like how do you increase all your chances to have something sustainable, even like the type of game you go for, like maybe should you go for the most risky thing right now, or should you do something predictable that is not the most passionate thing, but at least you're starting to create your stability, your financial autonomy. So having someone owning finances and like make sure you have your company is durable in the long term is important. Sharing like regularly transparency about where the company is in terms of runway, what are the challenges, including people in the conversation, and sometimes they could even be part of the solutions. It's not easy, but yeah, if you feel uncomfortable to share, then maybe it reveals that there's a problem here.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I know we've talked about, we recognize that we are works in progress, so we are not finished. And I think hiring for this growth mindset, so somebody who continually wants to learn, they're an expert, but they also want to continue to grow, and to find out things that they don't know, and even question their own views and biases of things. And I think also the decision making, for me, reoccurring decision making audits are really important. Actually, now like it's become practice now that we'll do some recaps of key decisions. So it's usually in the form of retros where we'll have a retro, but then I'll go back and mark down what were the decisions, why they were made, just so everybody's remembers, because it's often so hard to remember each of the small decisions. I think that's been really helpful. And then the financial transparency, I think also when you have a company, for me, it's like I would share all of that information, like not everybody's salaries, of course, and some of the more confidential information. But I think just to get an idea of what is the breakdown of the runway, like how much time do you have, and also bringing this notion that, hey, there is a cutoff point where we need to think about what we're doing as a company, and if it makes sense, that we don't get into this situation where we're not in control of our own destiny. if you're out 1 year, it'll give you enough time to sort of change whatever you're doing, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 months to really, change quickly what you're doing. Maybe there's something that you want to do, like you said, like a more safe product. You want to get some money on the door, something that can really fly. You change everything, you try to go for that. I think there is an opportunity there when you're a year out. Any later than that, it's already too much, because you start to lose leverage. Maybe the last one is for a new company. And I think this is something that we have for Papukaya, is like being united around a very powerful shared vision of the company. So what is the one thing that you all want to do, and it aligns with your own motivations? So in this case, with Papukaya, it's bringing a genre-defining hit to the casual space. And I think that excites all of us there. And I think that's something that you should take into the next company.
Very concrete, actionable. Thanks a lot, Collin. So thank you very much for sharing so openly a difficult, dark story of past behavior. Unfortunately, one among many, and in a very genuine way, and taking away the learnings that others could use with more wisdom for the future. So thanks a lot, Collin, for today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Sophie.
Thanks for listening to this latest episode of the Rise and Play podcast. I am trying to grow a community of conscious leaders across the industry and beyond. So if you want to join this movement, please share the podcast with other conscious leaders, because we have so much more we can learn from each other. Also, please don't forget to follow the show so you don't miss out on future content. Every episode is packed with actionable insights that will help you improve your leadership skills now. And if you are interested in learning more on the topics that we discussed today, you can find more insights on riseandplay.io, and there you will also find my free masterclass on conscious leadership. So have a great week, and until the next time,